You were born in Pennsylvania, April 1937, right?
Right.
And that
Well,
makes you a Taurus, I think?
I think of it as belly of Taurus for people who keep track of those sort of things. Somewhere in the middle.
Do you identify with your personality being like a Taurus in any way?
I have been known to be bullheaded. When I think I'm right, I will push through on things, but
Are you kind of earthy and like beautiful
wait,
things?
before we get too far into that, is my image all right? You got your recorder on and all that? And
Yes.
should I be magnified, more just face, or am I just right?
You're just right.
Okay.
Okay.
I've been spoiled by camera crews that have come by in the past, and they spend an hour fussing with the light and the angle and whatnot. So anyway,
No, we're more concerned with the content.
now I was born in Pennsylvania, but only because I grew up in Trenton, and my mother's doctor was just across the river in Morrisville, Pennsylvania.
Got it.
Otherwise, it's not as romantic as Pennsylvania. I'm just from New Jersey.
Like Bruce Springsteen. Do you know as a psychologist, your Myers-Briggs, your Enneagram, your any of those interesting personality types?
I used to. I started out studying personality, so I had all the courses and naturally took all the tests. The Myers-Briggs didn't particularly help me. I took the MMPI a number of times. I came out sane, fortunately.
I
The
don't know.
Enneagram has been the most useful one to me, but of course I don't think the APA recognizes that.
Which one is it?
I'm a 7.
Oh, on the Enneagram.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're fun and like to travel and have adventures. That's great.
I'd say even more characteristic is I come up with reasons and plans. And I've got backup plans for my plans just in case.
Mm.
I actually found that work very useful in understanding myself and making my functioning a little less habitual and automatic to be able to spot I'm being 7-ish again. Take it easy on that.
My guess is that on the Myers-Briggs, you're an extroverted, intuitive.
Introverted.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Intuitive rather than sensing, right?
I don't really recall, but I suspect I'd be more sensing.
Oh, we
But
got to know this.
then I've worked on becoming more sensitive, which could be rephrased as not being lost in my ideas all the time, but actually looking around at what's around me.
Well, then I think you're probably intuitive rather than sensing, if you
That-
had to work on it. And then thinking or feeling, probably thinking.
Oh, you betcha.
And then the last one, you're probably the J, the planner, rather than the open options P.
I don't recall that distinction on the test, but I'm certainly a planner.
Yeah, then, okay, so we think you're an INTJ.
Sure.
Correct me when you have a chance. So growing up in Trenton, New Jersey, what was going on in your family life that led you to be a successful student and want to study psychology? What was their attitudes towards that and towards religion?
Well, my parents didn't try to shape me in any particular direction that I'm aware of, except to do what was right. So I picked up a strong sense of right and wrong from my mother, and she was a 1, so of course she knew exactly what was right and wrong about everything.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons I became a 7. I mean, when you're faced with a judge, you've got to be a lawyer to know how, well, yes, you said not to do that, but if the circumstances were so-and-so. Psychology, I was just always curious about how my mind worked and how other people's minds worked. I was surprised at myself sometimes, and I was often surprised at how could that person suddenly do that? What made them tick?
What were they? Did they send you to church? What was the religious
Oh, yeah.
practice?
My mother had no formal interest in religion. She already knew what was right, so that was no problem. And my father, I don't know if he ever went to church in his life. He had no interest at all. But my grandmother, who lived in the apartment downstairs from us, took me to Sunday school and then church when I was a kid. And I bought it. I mean, grandmothers are unconditional love, you know. So if it was good enough for her, it was good enough for me.
And what church did she take you to?
She took me to a Lutheran church.
That's right.
All right, so I learned a lot about being guilty. All right, and feeling a little jealous of those Catholics who could go and confess their guilt and then they didn't have it anymore. But we Lutherans carried our guilt because we were strong and tough. I can think back to a lot of stuff in my religious upbringing that I think screwed me up very badly psychologically, but at the same time it touched on something real and important, which meant me to have my interest in building bridges between the scientific and the spiritual.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, there's a lot of nonsense in religion and a lot of beautiful stuff and a lot of nonsense in science culture, quite aside from the actual scientific findings.
You call it scientism. So sometimes there's a rigidity and a dogmatic point of view, not willing to accept this new paradigm of non-materialism, that kind of thing, right?
To put it mildly, yes. It's dogmatism. I was just remarking to my wife earlier today that I think, in a sense, it's amazing that scientists are human beings and they're bullheaded and prejudiced and biased and whatnot, and yet we have managed to refine a lot of our knowledge in spite of all these difficult human characteristics. Mm-hmm. So science is quite good that way. It says, what's the evidence for something? Or, yeah, your theory is wonderful, but will it predict what's going to happen next? If it won't predict what's going to happen next, it might be interesting philosophy or speculation, but it's not science.
And it has to be replicable, right?
That's highly desirable, but not absolutely. I mean, you can't replicate a particular comet. It comes, it's gone. You can observe things about it and so forth, come up with some general rules that might apply to future comets. So replication is good, but it's not an absolute criterion like that.
Okay, got it.
And can the geologist replicate the Grand Canyon? Take a long time to do that experiment.
Right. What was it like to be at MIT with probably as many people as bright as you, something you probably hadn't experienced
Shocking.
in high school?
Absolutely shocking. I went from being the real smart one in my high school class to, oh my God, they've had calculus already? And they understand it? So it was a major shift to find that there was a lot of stuff I didn't understand very well. And that totally changed my course. I was going to be an electrical engineer, and I still have a lot of very practical knowledge of electronics, or at least the electronics of 50 years ago, right? I understand vacuum tubes. I like the little glow when the tubes heat up. But I wasn't going to make it as an engineer, and then I discovered there was such a field as psychology. I had known about that in high school. I don't know if vocational counseling had been invented, but I thought, oh, I can learn some stuff about the mind, and this is very interesting.
And then you went to Duke because you met Mr. Rhine, and he encouraged you.
J.B. Rhine, yes.
And how did you make that connection?
There was a theater in Boston that specialized in showing foreign films, which for somebody from Trenton was pretty exotic stuff. But it turns out that this Exeter Street Theater is owned by a couple of ladies who were old-time spiritualists. And once a week, or at least once or twice a month, they would have lectures on spiritualism and parapsychology and things like that. And so I met J.B. Rhine through going to one of those lectures and whatnot. And, you know, I'm the kind of student who has questions for the teacher all the time. So pretty soon they were inviting me to tea after the speaker, and I got to actually know people that way.
Nice.
So I met J.B. Rhine that way, and actually he helped me transfer to Duke when I decided that psychology was what I wanted. They didn't have anything like psychology at MIT back then.
And what got you interested in going to those lectures in the first place?
As a kid, I just bought into my religion. As I said, my grandmother took me, good enough for her, good enough for me. And then I became a teenager, of course, and started noticing that adults are hypocrites. They say to do it this way, but they often don't act that way. And I was also fascinated by everything concerned with science, and I saw that science looks at a lot of religious stuff and says, no way, that's just not the factual way it is. So, with the perspective of many years after that, I realized that I went through a religious crisis that a lot of people go through between the religion they were brought up in and a scientific worldview. And there's two extremes that are quite common when people go through that. One is to kind of get overly attached to their religion. No, this is God's truth. Don't give me that science crap. I'll just ignore it. The other is, right, science is right, religion is all nonsense. Don't bother me with it. But I kept feeling, wait a minute, there's something real happening within religion too. But what part of it is real and what part of it isn't? So I luckily, in my widespread readings in science, came across old books on parapsychology and psychical research, as it used to be called. And I realized, other people have gone through this same kind of questioning and said, let's apply the methods of science, careful observation, experiments, and so forth, to religious or spiritual phenomena and see if we can start separating out what's really important from what's not. And that's what I've been doing the rest of my life, basically.
That started in high school or when you got to MIT?
Oh, yeah, that started in high school, yeah. I was way out there reading all this weird stuff.
Did you start from the library?
I sometimes have a picture of my hometown library saying, this is where I grew up.
And then at Duke, you worked with Ryan in his doing experiments? And
No, not really. That's how it was supposed to be. Ryan had already told me he would give me a part-time job in his parapsychology laboratory, and that was why I picked Duke, because I could major in psychology there and study parapsychology. But I had already taken a summer job, which Ryan had advised me against taking, with this man, Andrea Puharich, who was considered a wild man by most parapsychologists. But it was fascinating to me because he thought he had electrical ways of enhancing extrasensory perception. Now, even way back then, I said the main problem in parapsychology was that ESP is very unreliable. I mean, you get these little effects once in a while. It's not very replicable. It's not very strong. It's hard to study. If you could put somebody into a certain electrical environment and make it happen much more reliably and strongly, the field would tremendously advance. So when Puharich claimed he had found a way of doing that, sure, you need a research assistant for the summer. I'd like to see what was done. So then I got to Duke and went in to see Ryan, and as far as Ryan was concerned, I had demonstrated that I did not have enough common sense and responsibility to want to be encouraged to get into parapsychology.
Wow.
So I was put on the list of people to be discouraged from visiting the laboratory. Now, of course, I didn't pay any attention to that, and I developed several friends there. And 50 years later, I was being asked by board members if I wanted to head that laboratory long after Ryan had died. So, and he and I actually came to an understanding. He realized after some time that I was not as crazy as he thought. But I can understand his rejecting me that way. If I had worked very hard to establish some area of science, and some wild-eyed kid who would argue with me, the authority, would argue with me, I didn't need people like that upsetting the apple cart, messing up everything that I had set up, so I quite understand how he felt.
Yeah, but sometimes those people are the most fun. I mean, it's the most exciting if you have someone who can point out where your logic fails or something.
Yeah, except I think I know most of the active parapsychologists in the U.S. at any rate, and I'm trying to think of one who's in it mainly for fun. They're a pretty serious bunch.
Well, when I ask them, what do you do for fun in the course of these interviews, that a lot of them say my work is fun.
My work is wonderful. Yes, it is fun, but I do other things for fun too. My wife and I used to hike and camp a lot. As we got older and we got tired of sleeping on the ground in a tent, we got a little tiny recreational vehicle so we could sleep on a mattress each night. And we'd go off in the spring or the fall to the Southwest and camp for 5 or 6 weeks in national parks and the like, hike around. That was quite wonderful. We don't do that as much now. We're getting a little older, but whatnot, so that's fun. And we did Aikido for years. That was a lot of fun also, so there's a lot of fun in my life.
And you sing.
Yes. Yes, my wife and I are going to the senior center nearby, which has a singing group once a week, and it's wonderful. And I listen to all these older people. I don't want to call them old people because I haven't accepted the fact that I'm old yet, right? I'm just older. And we listen to these people who've clearly gone through a whole life of all sorts of experiences singing these old songs, some of which now strike me as, wow, they're about joy and disappointment and the difficulties of life and the glimpses. Wow, this is really quite amazing.
You to go back.
No, I won't sing for you.
To go back to UNC, you did your dissertation on post-hypnotic suggestions. Say a little bit about that research.
Well, I had always been a very vivid dreamer. It was normal for me to wake up, even when I was a kid, remembering at least 1 or 2 dreams, and they were very vivid and so forth. And I really wondered about them. What is this funny thing that happens to me at night? Mm-hmm. You know, and even the bad dreams, the nightmares I had, you know. So I was really interested in dreams, and I decided I'd focus on dream research while I was in graduate school. And I was also very interested in hypnosis by that time. So both my master's thesis and dissertation were to test an idea which was accepted as scientific truth at the time, namely that people did not dream about just the things that had happened during the day unless they were really disguised in a Freudian sort of sense. And you couldn't get them to dream about that. And I said, well, I'm going to try hypnotizing them before they go to sleep and making some suggestions about dream about. And then I gave them a very detailed plot for them to dream about. And I found I could have very strong influences on what the content of nighttime dreams was that way. And also make them a little longer and shorter and whatnot. So it was part of my general interest in altered states of consciousness and learning how to use them instead of just, gee, there's these funny things that happen to us once in a while.
When I kept a dream journal, I found that my unconscious would work through emotional issues. Like I had a series of dreams over months about having to teach math, and for me that's traumatic. And so at the end of the series, I said, no, I'll teach anything in social science, but I won't teach math. And they said, okay. So I was learning to be more assertive. And to me, dreams do that function of resolving emotional issues. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of processing of what's going on within us, you know, and it may not always be obvious.
Right.
And sometimes I guess it's just kind of has no particular meaning at all, just like life. I mean, I don't think what I had for breakfast this morning has any great psychological significance, and some dreams too.
Right.
But yeah, a lot of meaning is possible there.
When you did your postdoc at Stanford, you continued with the interest in hypnosis. What were you interested in?
Well, the reason I did the postdoc there was that was one of the 2 active academic laboratories in the country dealing with hypnosis research. This was being done by Professor Ernest Hilgard, who had been a very prominent psychologist, originally in learning theory, all that terribly dull stuff with rats and pigeons. But he got interested in hypnosis and advanced our knowledge of it and so forth. So that was a natural place for me to go. And of course, I got exposed to California, which was something for somebody who grew up in New Jersey and then went to school in North Carolina.
And what did you find that was new? I mean, what hypnosis, it accesses the unconscious, you give people suggestions, they follow through. What did you do to elaborate on that simple view of hypnosis?
Well, one of the things I did, which I still don't think is adopted as widely as it ought to be, was there was a tendency to think somebody is hypnotized or they're not hypnotized. But it's not that simple. People may get hypnotized to various degrees. And if you don't keep track of that in some fashion, you've got confused information coming to you. So I worked on developing a self-report scale where I could say state, and somebody would give me a number on a scale I'd already defined, and found that was very useful in indicating what level of hypnosis they were in. And then I came up with a very wild hypnotic technique of having somebody hypnotize another person, and then the other hypnotized person hypnotize the hypnotist, and then the hypnotist deepen the hypnotized person. And they go into very interesting shared stuff. Some people think it was telepathic. I can't say that because it wasn't set up to test that kind of thing. But it led to a very powerful altered state of consciousness that, again, I don't think anybody's really followed up. It was too far out there.
Did you experience that, being hypnotized by the subject you hypnotize? Kind of?
No, I'm a lousy hypnotic subject. I know too much about it. If somebody tried to hypnotize me, I think, oh, he's using Erickson's confusion technique there, but he's going too fast on that part. Please, be quiet. No, well, got to analyze.
You've been interested in Gurdjieff, who says that we are basically socially hypnotized and kind of automatons who don't think. So how did those two kind of go together?
In looking at consciousness in general, I coined the term consensus consciousness to replace the term normal consciousness, to recognize the fact that it's just not something that's only biologically given and the same for all of us. It's very much created by the consensus of our culture on what you reinforce in a child, what you punish, and so forth. And when I want to emphasize the bad aspects of that it cuts down your flexibility, I've talked about it as consensus trance. And I shouldn't do that because trance is supposed to be a neutral word, but it has negative connotations. So if you're in consensus trance, it means you can only take a certain socially accepted approach to thinking about a problem. Maybe some different approach would make the whole problem much simpler.
Do you think that Trump's base is an example of that kind of a trance state?
Oh, that's a tough one. What makes it worse is that I think we're all in that kind of trance state almost all the time. But we don't know it because we've been told this is the way you should be and it's normal. Relating that back to Gurdjieff indeed said, we're so thoroughly conditioned, so narrowed in the way we perceive and think about and act on things. I found that to be very, very true. And I found Gurdjieff's psychology extremely useful in getting people aware of the value of cultivating mindfulness, of recognizing in a situation you're not just in the situation, it's not just that you're perceiving what's there, you're bringing hopes and fears and conditioning to it. And that doesn't mean you're bad, it means you're normal in a sense, but if you don't know that, you're stuck by it. You're caught within that particular set of concepts and conditionings. And there are too many instances where creativity comes from being able to drop that tight, narrow, quote, normal, unquote, way of thinking about things. Gurdjieff was very good in starting to adapt some Eastern ideas to a more modern Western approach, and my own work is writing several books about that, has been to further take that ideas of Gurdjieff and put them into more modern Western psychological terms, except the ones I don't understand. I mean, Gurdjieff had a lot of ideas that they may be profound truths or they may be utter nonsense, and I can't tell the difference, so I avoid talking about those.
What culture have you been in that has the most different, contrasting hypnotic state than the one in the U.S.? Where have you been when you thought, whoa, this is really a different mindset?
I'm honored you think of me as a world traveler who's been assessing the minds of people and cultures all over the world. But I don't have to go that far. And I can't answer it on that thing, but many times I've come to realize that somebody that I think I know very well has a quite different way of perceiving the world and reacting to it. And that's where this Enneagram stuff came in, when I recognized that certain people had a whole different way of organizing things. Recognizing my mother, for instance, as a perfectionist, as a one. I realized, wait a minute, I've been trying to please her my whole life, and it's impossible. A perfectionist will always find a flaw in anything you did. I can remember when I published my first book, Altered States of Consciousness, and I proudly handed her a copy. Look, Mom, I published my first book. And she looks at it and she says, oh, that's nice. Oh, look, they published it with a smudge on the cover. Oh, Mom, yeah, okay. Fortunately, once I learned how different other people's mindsets can be, though, I learned to be more tolerant of those things and just recognized they're built differently than me. They think differently than me. Let's try to communicate in spite of that instead of what's wrong with them.
I think where I've seen it most physically is I did a lot of workshops in Japan, and the woman who brought me lived in the U.S. for 5 or 7 years and then moved back to Japan, and her whole body changed. She kind of shrunk, got more interior after coming back to Japan, and she just radiated differently, because in Japan you've got to keep closed because there's so many people. I guess that's part of the reason.
Yeah, body posture can say a lot about the internal psychological processes going on. I used to do an exercise with the course I taught on humanistic and transpersonal psychology, in which I would do some lecturing about body posture affecting your mood, but then to actually bring it home to the people, I asked them to stand up and to stand in sort of a classic depressed posture, head down a little bit, shoulders down and the like. And I said, walk around the room that way and try to be happy. You can be happy in that posture, but it's hard work. It's so easy to slip into a more depressed way with something like that. Whereas, put your shoulders back a little, step a little further and whatnot. Simple things like that can make that much difference. My goodness.
After Stanford, did you start teaching at Berkeley?
No. In fact, I've never taught at Berkeley.
Oh.
After Stanford, I took a job at the University of Virginia for a year in Charlottesville.
Oh.
As a result of Ian Stevenson, the psychiatrist who did so much reincarnation research. Although I actually had very little contact with him. He was always off in foreign countries collecting reincarnation cases. But it was interesting to live in Virginia for a while, but at the same time I had an offer from the University of California, Davis, which had just been converting to a general campus, and that brought me back to California. And I was in love with California by then, so that was all right. Mr. Jefferson created a nice culture in Charlottesville back in 1776. Hasn't changed a bit. No, not really, but, there was a different fit.
And then you taught it, and I think still do it, at Sophia, which used to be Transpersonal Studies. And I'm wondering, what's the difference between teaching in a establishment UC campus and Sophia, which is more holistic?
Okay, first thing, I'm going to call it by its original name, the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, because shortly after it changed to Sophia under new ownership and so forth, there were a lot of changes made and I retired from there, so I don't really have a good feel for what goes on there now. But as to differences in teaching, I'll tell you a story. Back in the 70s, humanistic psychology had become very prominent, and, people were saying you got to learn to express your feelings and sense your emotions, and you need some emotional education as well as just intellectual education. Transpersonal psychology was being invented also. So I thought, okay, I should be teaching our psychology majors something about humanistic and transpersonal psychology. So another colleague who was also interested in that and I proposed to the psychology faculty that we would teach a course on that, upper division, okay? And there were questions asked, and it turned out people asked questions like, humanistic psychology, people have feelings, don't they? Well, there's no place on a university campus for feelings. We're here to learn valid knowledge. So the only way we could get permission to teach this course was that if I said, okay, we will promise the students that there might be times when we would invite them to have a feeling, but we'd never require a feeling, and it certainly wouldn't affect their grade. That made it safe, okay? That was one of the most fun courses and valuable courses I ever taught, but had to be real careful with feelings there. I always used to tell this story to the students, too. They thought it was hilarious.
Define transpersonal psychology. I know you're a pioneer in the field.
Yeah, transpersonal, conventional psychology is basically materialistic in its overall philosophy. What physicists and chemists have taught us about reality is the absolute answer. You are what you are because of electrochemical changes in your brain and so forth. Well, then obviously when you die, you're dead. There's no such thing as any kind of survival or something. You're isolated inside your head, something like that. Humanistics and much emphasis on being really rational. You can study emotions in people who had psychological pathologies, of course, but that shows you just how bad emotions were. Humanistic psychology brought in the big thing of, wait a minute, we've got to study emotions also and train ourselves to be emotionally intelligent, not just intellectually intelligent. But it's still, in wanting to find acceptance within the mainstream, it still tended to stay within that materialistic framework, not by pledging allegiance to it so much as simply not asking questions about it. The spiritual was ignored, basically. Transpersonal psychology took the whole thing one step further and said, wait a minute, people have spiritual experiences. They feel that they're not just a physical body confined in their head. They're part of something much bigger and so forth. We don't have to take a position on the reality or non-reality of that, but for God's sake, we need to study that stuff. These are some of the most important experiences people can have. You know, like take a near-death experience. You can get more change in a person's life in 3 minutes of being dead than in all the rest of their life put together. So transpersonal psychology said, again, we're not a religion. We're not saying God said it's like so and you better believe it or go to hell. But we're going to study these things. We're going to apply basic science and scholarship that says, look more carefully what happens, see what the consequences of it are, and so forth. See how these spiritual or transpersonal experiences affect people. How can people be guided to integrate them better in their life, and so forth. Those are all part of what we should do. We thought transpersonal psychology was going to be the next major leading force in psychology, but computers beat us out. Computers, you can program them so neatly and build models of the mind that way and so forth. So transpersonal psychology remains a fairly minor part of psychology, suitable for us California kooks, I guess. But
did positive
good.
Did positive psychology evolve out of transpersonal psychology?
You know, as I don't know positive psychology well, but I think it came in quite independently from, can't think of the man's name now, observing his children and noticing something quite different about children and adults and so forth. I can't make that historical connection there, but.
How did you get involved with the Stanford Research Institute and remote viewers?
Well, it's funny. I was just writing something about that today for somebody. I got interested in parapsychology back in the time when it was still very much a matter of card guessing as far as any laboratory experiments.
The Rhine cards, the Zener cards.
Yeah, Rhine cards, basically. You shuffle the deck very thoroughly and ask people, guess red or black, and you expect 50% by chance and whatnot. And some people can score consistently higher, but there's a problem. it's as boring as can be. I mean, a few times it's interesting. And after that, same old thing over and over and over again. Well, I was having lunch with Russel Targ once. I had met him during my postdoc out at Stanford. And he talked about this new kind of procedure they were using at Stanford Research Institute that he was calling remote viewing. That was deliberately picked as a word not like ESP or something like that, because that was weird stuff, but remote viewing, that's like remote sensing, that's engineering and real science. And he was telling me about this procedure for getting remote viewing, where somebody goes and hides basically, and you have somebody back at the laboratory start writing down and sketching impressions of where they are. And if you have blind judges judge it, they get an awful lot of accurate things. And he wasn't getting the boring kind of thing. In fact, some of the best evidence for the existence of ESP with the card guessing tests was that as you kept testing a person with them, their scores got worse and worse. And chance doesn't get bored, but people do. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I really wondered about this remote viewing, so I had a meeting at my home one night to have him and Harold Puthoff, the other physicists doing these things, talk about their results, and they presented a number of very impressive things. And then they said, well, this is all the very intellectual analysis. We'll show you how remote viewing works by having you do it, okay? Hal's going to go away from here, and in 20 minutes I'm going to pass out some pads to you, and all you folks will sit down and start drawing sketches of where he is. 20 minutes, and he's got a car. That narrows him down to about 1 million places, I think. So intellectual mind, give up. There's no way you can guess anything like that. And that was one of the problems with the card guessing things, incidentally. With only a few choices, you tended to guess. I've guessed a lot of black. Maybe I should guess red or something. So he went off. 20 minutes later, we started sketching. And I didn't expect to come much from it because I thought their experiments were good, but I wasn't psychic. So I sat there with my eyes closed, waiting for some images to come, and vague, amorphous kinds of images. They didn't really mean anything to me. Except once, for about 2 seconds, I suddenly saw a bunch of white machines all arrayed beside each other with something round on them, turning in a very bright situation, like I was looking inside a factory or something like that. And that was it. Like so I made a little sketch of it and whatnot, and figured, it's just some guess my mind is making. Well, Hal came back, and we got in the car, and he went down to where the target that he had picked was. And when we first stopped in front of the door to the target, it was on Main Street. I looked around. It didn't look like anything that had anything to do with even my vague imagery. And then we stepped over a couple of feet and looked through the big plate glass window of the laundromat with all the white machines going round and round and round. Oh, well, okay, I wouldn't present this as proof from one instance, but gosh, this stuff could work pretty good. So I managed to get a year's leave from the university to be a consultant on the remote viewing thing and saw a lot of other very good instances of it, got some feeling for the intelligence agency applications of it. Most of which I couldn't talk about at the time because I had to have a security clearance to even consult on it. I never did figure out why I had to have 2 security clearances, and one, if I was bad, was a 5 years in jail and $5,000 fine, but the other one was a 10 years in jail and $10,000 fine, and I wondered how they figured out the difference. But anyway, a lot of that stuff has since come out through Freedom of Information Acts, and there Edwin May and I'm going to mispronounce her name.
Jessica Utz.
No. I won't go further than this. Just happened to have, sitting right behind me here.
Oh, the Stargate Archives.
The Stargate Archives.
And who wrote that? Oh, that's from the feds.
Yeah. This is Sonali Marwaha and Ed May. And 2 volumes of it are out. The 3rd one will come out this year, the 4th one out later. It contains all documentation of more than 20 years of research. There's no doubt in my mind that it's a useful intelligence gathering method. Now, let me tell you another story there. When I was asked to be a consultant on that, I thought, where are these folks getting support from? Intelligence agencies, CIA. I'm a Californian. I'm into peace and all that. I don't know about this. But then it was pointed out to me something that's very obvious in retrospect. Almost all wars start because one side thinks it can surprise the other. But if you have good intelligence, you begin to doubt that you could surprise people, so maybe you won't start that war after all. Oh, so good intelligence actually works toward peace in this imperfect world. So, okay. That was a revelation.
Did you find that you could teach people, or didn't they usually do like a preparation, some kind of meditative preparation before doing the viewing?
No.
No.
No, SRI did something that was quite different from most parapsychology experiments. They looked for people who probably had some psychic ability to begin with, instead of, as I like to define psychology sometimes, psychology is the study of the college sophomore by former college sophomores for the benefit of future college sophomores. And parapsychology tended to ape that. They actually had a wonderful psychological procedure for making it happen, and they didn't know it. You see, Puthoff and Targ were physicists. They didn't do psychology, they did science, and they were physicists, and physicists are at the top of the social hierarchy for science. And I would ask them once in a while, what's your psychological preparation to have people do so well? They'd look at me blankly. We don't do anything, we do an experiment. The first time I visited their laboratory, I discovered they had an incredible psychological procedure. You drive up to this place, which is one of the world's most prestigious think tanks. You can't just go in. You go into the lobby, and you can't go any further unless you're expected, and you're issued a security badge, and someone will accompany you at all times. Oh, wow, this is not like a university campus. What's going on here? Targ met me and took me off to their laboratory, and it was a long ways away in the building, so several times, instead of taking the long way around through the halls, he would cut through some other laboratory, and there were all these machines around, the lights blinking, the graphs graphing. I was in a temple of big science. Wow! And then, take me into their lab and show me examples of past really excellent remote viewings. I just had an incredible psychological preparation of this is the real stuff with the most prestige behind it. This is a hell of a lot different from some professor telling a college sophomore, I want you to take this test. So they had a marvelous psychological preparation.
It was like
they didn't know it, which probably made it even more effective for them. They weren't having to manipulate anybody. They were just doing the job.
It's like a ritual pilgrimage to go through the corridors and get the badge, and so you're
yeah.
And this wasn't on the Stanford campus, right?
No. Stanford Research Institute was started during the Second World War as consulting projects for the military. And then when student activism came in, students got really angry about what's something military have to do with our university. So Stanford Research Institute made itself entirely separate from the Stanford campus. Mm-hmm. No connection at all. Mm-hmm. So it's a private thing that does research for companies and some of the intelligence agencies and so forth, completely independent. I think they call them SRI International now. They don't even say Stanford.
Do you guess that the government, the intelligence agencies are still using these, the remote viewing?
I think they're too stupid to do it now. They did it for 20-some years. They did hundreds of operational remote viewing stuff. So, for instance, they once gave them a set of coordinates. This was before everybody had a cell phone that they could plug in coordinates for any place in the world, and said, tell us what's there. And it was someplace in Asia. Asia's a big place. They had satellite coverage, and there was a very big building, about a quarter, half a mile back from the Arctic Ocean, something like that. And satellites won't tell you what's inside a building, so they ask the remote viewers what's in there. One of the best remote viewers, Joe McMoneagle, described a new kind of submarine, 3 times as big as any submarine that had ever been built, double hulls, things like that. The agency that has tasked him to do it, then headed by somebody who I believe later became a Secretary of Defense, said that's crap. Nobody can build a submarine that big and so forth. McMoneagle pressured them somehow to have a satellite over there again at a certain time, 3 months later, when they watched the world's biggest submarine come out through the newly dug canal into the Arctic Ocean. That's useful sort of information, yeah.
Yeah. They're probably doing it, but not talking about it.
Well, if they are, they really aren't using anybody who's in the known scientific community in parapsychology, which is possible. But for those 20-some years, they pretty much supported this research with almost no publicity of any sort.
Yeah.
But then some politicians found out about it. The government's wasting our money on these weird psychics or something like that, and they just shut it down out of prejudice that way. And it's a real loss. I think it's irresponsible of the government not to continue this. I'm all for discouraging anybody from starting wars.
Yeah. You think?
Yeah. Yeah.
People get killed.
Yeah.
I'd like readers and viewers to know when your most difficult times in your life have been and how you've coped, so they can see how a smart person deals with their challenges.
Well, you create a lot of words and thinking about possibilities, and sometimes the words are helpful, but words can also simply distract you. You asked me about my Enneagram type, and I said I was a type 7. One of the nicknames for that is an ego plan. Well, as a kid, I suffered a lot, like most kids do. The grown-ups, the parents don't let you do things, they spank you or something like that. There's a lot of situations where you can't do anything about it. You're just a little kid and you're among these powerful giants. But I discovered that if I thought about clever ways I might be able to do something, that felt good. And I gradually discovered that if I could continually think clever thoughts, that kind of insulated me from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, from the pressures of things going on. So one of the ways I've coped in life is by continually thinking about interesting things. And it's rewarding in and of itself. I'm curious. I like to think about how things happen and how things might go and things that could be tried and so forth. This frustrates the hell out of some people. My wife and I get into arguments sometimes because she talks about a problem she's having and I immediately think of something you can do, and she gets mad at me. She wants me to listen to her feelings, not just go off on something. Oh, yeah, okay. So one of the other things I've done is to try to learn to be more emotionally intelligent and shut my mouth for a while and actually listen to other people's problems and so forth. And keep following what I think is important. I ran into a lot of prejudice in the scientific community at the university level for daring to be interested in things like ESP or altered states of consciousness. And it resulted in a lot of pressures I had to deal with, which were quite unfair. So, there were times when some of the faculty at various universities were talking about how liberal their university is and how much they respected academic freedom because, look, we have this fellow Targ on our faculty, while others were actively working to how can we get rid of him. I'm retired enough now that that's in the past, but I've taken a lot of unfair crap that way. But I have a commitment to going for truth when I see it and trying to do the right thing. And when the going gets tough, I get bullheaded, if you want to make me into a Taurus, and do the best I can.
How do you make a long-term marriage, like you said, you've been married 50 years, how do you make that stay vital over time?
It's more like 60-some years. Oh, I wish I had some general rules that could apply to everybody. I don't know. We went through a lot of ups and downs. I'm basically madly in love with my wife and vice versa, and I don't know what to say.
Some people say that having kids is the hardest time for a marriage because all the focus is on the kids. Did you find that?
Oh, yeah, especially when they're teenagers. More suffering from worrying about my kids than most other things in life, but they turned out great.
How many do you have, children?
A son and a daughter, and now a grandson and a granddaughter.
Yeah, that's the best, huh?
Yeah. Grandkids are the best because you just get to spoil them. You don't have to be so darn responsible.
That's great. You were at University of Nevada, Las Vegas Consciousness Studies. Where did you fit that in?
Oh, that was funny. I had taken early retirement from UC Davis and was teaching at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. And then a prominent millionaire in Las Vegas, Robert Bigelow, was creating a chair of consciousness studies at the University of Nevada and looking around for somebody to fill it. And I thought that's an interesting opportunity if they're going to follow through and really create a program in consciousness studies, because understanding our minds is so important. And I managed to get a year off from the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology to go there. Now, if I say Las Vegas is different from the California Bay Area, it would be quite an understatement. It was a great place for my wife and I because there were so many wonderful places to camp out in the Southwest there, especially if we went in the spring and the fall when it wasn't that hot. The university basically gave me an office and a part-time assistant and let me teach one course and otherwise ignored me because they wanted the money that was coming with this thing, but they didn't really want the topic. So I did what I could, taught what I thought was a good course, got some writing done, a little research done. After that, they gave the position to Raymond Moody for several years, which was a very good thing to do. And I think after that, they ran out of the money on it or something like that, and the whole thing faded away.
How do you define consciousness studies?
Now, the first thing is to tell you what went through my head, which you thought that. I wanted to point at my head, which shows my cultural conditioning that says consciousness arises from the actions of the brain.
Yes.
Okay. The brain is my personal biocomputer. It's very important in what I do. It has a lot of effect on how I perceive the world, how I think about it, and so forth. But all my research has told me that's only part of it. It's like this biocomputer has some connections to the big web. Something that we can't really define in ordinary sorts of terms, but that would behoove us to know a lot more about. That's the spiritual side of things. That's why I often describe my work as trying to build bridges between the spiritual and the scientific. It's no good just saying, well, there is no such thing, or, well, yes, if you have an idea that's weird and it's spiritual, it must be true. Nonsense in every area of life. But we can improve our knowledge of these things. So, answering your question more specifically, the consciousness I'm experiencing right now, in my way of thinking, is a result of the combination of whatever this larger spiritual thing is deeply embedded within the structures of my brain. It's like the only reason I can see you right now is because there's a big computer at my end and at your end that's making all sorts of translations to send the information back and forth. I can't see this spiritual computer, as it were, directly. Right? I have to infer it in a lot of ways. People have mystical experiences sometimes and talk about these things, but our level of talking about them so far is not very useful. They all say it's ineffable. And then they go on for thousands of words to explain why they can't explain it very well. That doesn't stop the more scholarly types. But I think we could learn to communicate somewhat better with words about it and apply it more. See, here's my goal, which I'm probably too old to see anything like this happen in my lifetime. But some of the transpersonal, I'll use that synonymously with spiritual at the moment, some of the transpersonal experiences people have drastically change a person because they know at a very deep level that we're all intimately connected. Well, wait a minute. That means if you're suffering, there's some very real sense in which I'm suffering. Our happiness, our fates are really interconnected. So the only sensible thing to do is to live a life that is concerned with other people, that is decent with other people, that's compassionate and so forth. It's not a should or you'll go to hell or God will be displeased or something like that. We're drawing on factual data about some very deep connections. I'd like to not only find out more about those connections, but find out how to teach people to have these kind of transpersonal experiences. See, I could say a lot of conventional religion at this point conditions people to believe the world is a certain way and that that's divine truth and get some emotional backup for it. And that has positive functions as well as negative sorts of functions. But if people could have these mystical transpersonal experiences and know at a very deep personal level that we're more than the personal, I think the world could improve very, very much.
Does use of psychedelics and drugs to...
If we use psychedelics properly, that would be one way. It's probably not correct for all sorts of people. You know, I was a subject in psychedelic experiments back in graduate school, so I got a feeling for what those were all about. But a person is very suggestible on those sorts of things. You can use psychedelics to make people awful. The Viking raiders back in the 10th century and the like took a psychedelic, Amanita muscaria. It's a very powerful mushroom just before their raiding ships hit the coast of England. They now felt no pain. They had enhanced perception and strength, and they slaughtered those less than human people on England and stole their stuff and tried to remember to get back on the ships before the drug effects wore off. That was their culture. They were the real people. They were the raiders. Your culture can shape a psychedelic like that. So, I mean, when people want to think about psychedelics, it's not just a drug. You have to think about the set and setting and the psychology of it. Otherwise, you don't have much of an understanding of it at all, and it can get out of hand. Meditation works real well for some people. For other people, it's probably a total waste of time to try to teach them to meditate. But what would work for them?
I'm thinking of Michael Pollan, whose new book is about psychedelics to deal with anxiety and depression and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of consciousness, it's very tempting to say quantum mechanics concept of entanglement and non-locality explain a lot of paranormal events. But physicists say, no, you can't say that. What's your understanding of...
Yes, I would quarrel with you on that statement, okay? I've had a lot of conversations with quantum physicists, and Targ and Puthoff were very much into quantum. They spent a lot of time trying to explain it to me, and they showed a lot of courage and persistence and whatnot. But what it comes down to is this. The quantum view that it talks about entanglement of things at a distance and things like that is very useful for loosening up the constraints of a strictly Newtonian worldview, that we're simply all right here with only known forces. But in terms of specifics, the theory or the rule I take for evaluating a scientific theory is a good theory does two things. It explains the observations you've already made, right? Instead of just a bunch of scattered things, they all make sense, something like that. And if your theory is really good, it will predict new things you can do, so you go out and test them. Quantum theory is not at all specific enough to have predicted anything you could do in an ESP experiment to make ESP working better than to believe it's all done by little green men in flying saucers who live in your eyebrows, or something ridiculous like that. Any belief system you have that says you can do it will probably make it more likely you'll show ESP and the like sometimes. But there's nothing specific in quantum theory yet. I tease my quantum physicist friends about this once in a while. I'm sure they get pissed off at me for reminding them that there's nothing specific yet. But I'm trying to encourage them to get more specific. It may work out, or it may be an interesting thing for loosening our minds up, but it's not really the answer.
But if two entangled photons, if one changes, the other changes instantaneously, it means there's some kind of communication or information exchange. So why doesn't that explain if I think heal the heart attack patient in San Francisco General, it'll help them get better?
Well, it doesn't explain it. That's the thing. I mean, how do you entangle the atoms in you, the healer's brain, and some patient in San Francisco's brain to begin with, so that they stay connected when you separate them, right? If you're talking about, I can talk about radio as a way of communicating over distances, and I can get very specific about how you build radio transmitters and receivers that work and so forth. Nobody's come up with something like that for psychic phenomena for ESP. Unless you believe that somebody's gadget will make you more psychic, in which case it may do it. But that's called encouragement. And it's good, okay? Learning to use encouragement and reinforcing people's feeling that they can do it is fine. But it's not the same thing as saying quantum physics can explain psychic stuff. Maybe.
What's your understanding of how the entangled particles, I know communication isn't the right word, but how they influence each other?
I don't have the slightest idea.
Does anybody?
It's a mystery. Does anybody? People write equations about it sometimes, and when you ask them to explain that in words us ordinary people can understand, they say, well, you have to know some pretty advanced mathematics, and the equations say this, and even some of the brightest minds of quantum physics long used to tell students, don't try to understand it, just calculate it. It works very well when you calculate it out. It doesn't make any sense in terms of the way we think about the world. Now, it may be that some altered state of consciousness would give us a better understanding of quantum theory. Could be. But at the moment, it's just for encouragement.
So we don't know if there is some kind of information field. Or they talk about a quantum vacuum? So there is some kind of... So there's like this potential of wave or particle kind of zipping around.
And how does that turn into consciousness and send information along? I used to be a ham radio operator, and eventually I got a job as a commercial radio operator. I can tell you how a radio, or at least an old vacuum tube one, works in exquisite detail and make it work in different ways, okay? I can demonstrate that my theoretical understanding has practical applications. It's not there for the quantum stuff and extrasensory perception yet.
Okay.
I encourage people to think about it. As I say, it's a real mind blower to think that things a million miles apart can communicate instantly. Putting communication in quotes. That's just the way we think about it.
Yeah.
But you got to get a lot more specific before it gets really useful. Of course, if you're a quantum physicist, you have a lot of mojo in telling people to do something extrasensory perception. That's part of that Stanford Research Institute thing. You're among these physicists. They are the big scientists. So if they say you can do it, yes, sir.
Got it. Have you personally experienced synchronicity, ESP? I know you've experienced altered states of consciousness. How has it impacted your development doing all this study?
When I first got interested in ESP and stuff, I'd never had any kind of psychic experience. And probably through most of the first part of my life, I didn't have any psychic experiences. Since then, I've had an occasional one, and they make sense to me. Okay? So, for instance, there was a while when I would be at work and I'd get a phone call from an old friend that I hadn't heard from in 15 years, Joe. And I'd go home and I'd be ready to tell my wife about it, but she'd start telling me about something important that happened during the day, and I forgot all about that. And then a little later she'd say, I wonder whatever happened to Joe. We haven't heard from him in a long time. Well, I wouldn't cite that as proof of anything, but led to a theory, okay? Maybe one way to make sure telepathy works better is you've got to be all set to communicate something by ordinary means. The energy's all gone, and something diverts you from it, and you forget all about it, and then it goes down into the unconscious and activates the mechanisms that really do the work. How would you test that? That could lead to some interesting experiments. I never had time to do them, but that's an interesting possibility. So I'm interested when they happen occasionally for when they give me ideas about how you could study it better. But, I'm not psychic, and, I'm not going to give anybody a reading of any sort or whatnot. And having more psychic experiences isn't particularly important to me. I'm trying to get, I don't want to say enlightened, because the more I learn about enlightenment, the less I have the slightest idea what the world enlightenment is. But I know a great deal about endarkenment. I'd say I'm an authority on endarkenment. I've practiced it and studied it for many, many years. The way my mind distorts things, is biased, doesn't get things that it should, and so forth. I'd like to get more intelligent in quite a variety of ways that way, especially emotionally as well as intellectually. That's more important to me personally.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's why I think we're on the planet, to evolve in that way.
I like to think of it that way. I like the analogy that it's like we're in the Marines, okay? This is an advanced learning school, and it is a really tough curriculum. But if we can graduate from it, that's really good. I may be making that up, but I like the idea.
What's your guess as to what happens after the body dies, based on what you've read about NDEs and that kind of thing?
I think something survives.
And Stevenson's work with kids remembering some past lives.
Some of the reincarnation stuff with kids is especially impressive that way. But, and I've read a lot of the old spiritualist literature and so forth, and the various evidence for survival, so I think something survives. But I have a hard time picturing it. For instance, when I die, I'd really like to meet my grandmother. Okay? She died when I was, 8 or 9, something like that. It's a tremendous love bond there. But, I don't think my grandmother has been waiting around for 60 years for me to die and come to have a meeting. If she's survived in some sense, what would be the nature of what survives? I think we can get better answers to some of these questions. Whether we're getting any absolute truth, I don't know. And of course, we'll all die at some point, and then if there is survival, we'll find out about it.
Right.
If there is no survival, we'll never be embarrassed for having believed in it, because there's nobody home to be embarrassed. So I think thinking there is some kind of survival and thinking of life as a long-term training. It's not like it doesn't matter what I do because it all comes to an end. There are long-term consequences. I think that's a useful philosophy of life.
Mm-hmm. Right. You said that one of the things you're interested in doing is teaching, and that, I think, kind of that's part of your dharma. You didn't use that word, but it's part of your path.
I love to teach, I love to get in front of a bunch of students and be talking about something interesting and see some eyes light up of, oh, I'm remembering a co-ed in one of my classes on altered states of consciousness once, who came up to me about halfway through the course at the end of class and said, I thought about dropping this course several times. You talk about this weird stuff and draw diagrams, and she looked at me and said, you've been talking about the way my mind works, haven't you? Yep.
That's exciting.
She made that connection, and that was fascinating. So being able to earn my living teaching and doing research has been wonderful.
It's also fun when they laugh, if you make them laugh.
Yes, yes.
They're awake.
Except you can't introduce any humor if they're starting to think about the test. I tried a few times. Students can't see any sense of humor when they're thinking about what's going to be on the test.
Right. And they want to know
I'm running down a little bit, Gail. Have we covered all the really important stuff yet? I know we haven't, but...
let's see. What about current research institutes? Like, who's doing the good work? Like IONS. Who else? What other agencies are doing parapsychology research?
Dean Radin and his colleagues at the Institute of Noetic Sciences are doing wonderful work. You know, I'm especially charmed with his work on the what do you call it when you have a particle that goes through two slits at once, something like. You know, that's incredible. He's taken something that physicists have speculated for 100 years and philosophized about what the role of consciousness is in this fundamental thing that led to quantum mechanics, and he's actually manipulating consciousness there and finding it makes a difference. Wow! That's the most exciting thing to me. And other than that, I'm not following the research very closely anymore. You know, I'm 81 now, and I figure I get to pretend I've acquired a little wisdom because I can't read everything anymore. I hope, at least, maybe I'm just opinionated. Who knows?
What's your, do you have another book in the offing, or what are you thinking about?
No. There's a major article I'm trying to get written of bringing remote viewing into all sorts of fields of science, but especially psychology and psychotherapy as a useful tool, which I think could have paradigm-changing possibilities. But real life keeps interfering from finishing writing this. And then there's a million smaller things I want to write. I put a lot of stuff on my blog as basically, here's something interesting you might be interested in. I hope somebody picks up on it. I'll never have time to get around to it.
How would remote viewing apply to the study of, like, anxiety?
To grossly oversimplify, if somebody comes to a therapist because they have some psychological problem, usually they don't understand why they have it. You know, I get anxious in certain situations, or I can't control my anger in certain situations, and they don't know why. And some types of psychotherapy, especially the kind of classical ones that go for insight, work on a basic theory that there's some kind of unconscious process going on that's driving you to this, and you don't know what triggers it off or how it works. So it's the therapist's job to discover what this is and to help you discover it in a more direct fashion, with the belief, which has some support for it, that once you clearly understand some of this stuff consciously, it won't overpower you like that. Well, classical psychoanalysis is very interesting for that, except people tend to be in classical psychoanalysis for years, going once or twice a week without getting there. Suppose the therapist had a team of remote viewers available who could somehow not tell you what's happening somewhere in the middle of Asia, but what's happening in some part of this person's mind. Big ethical questions there, of course, but you know, you hire the therapist to help you figure stuff out anyway, so I think this could be worked out. But if the remote viewers who had no ordinary information could say, ask him about John. I even have a story from a very accomplished remote viewer who was doing something like that with a psychiatrist once, who had a patient who never said anything. Soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, never said anything. And this remote viewer said, ask him about John. And so at the next session, the therapist said, tell me about John. And the patient jumped up and nearly strangled him. Who the hell told you about John? I've never told anybody about John. Maybe they hit something interesting. Now, that tells you that things have to be done with skill and consideration and so forth. But there are possibilities there. It could be it's an idea that won't work out. I don't know. It's like my proposal for creating state-specific sciences years ago, where you do science in altered states of consciousness. It's an idea that I like to think is ahead of its time. Could be a loony idea that won't really work, but until it's tried, we don't know.
Because the conscious mind is such a small part
of
the mind. If you had access to more, you might come up with more.
Reading some stuff about Einstein, for instance, and his creative process, the part I picked up on was that he has a sensory feeling for shapes moving. Well, how do you teach something like that? But maybe in a certain state of consciousness it's more clear. Or I talked to some mathematicians about how do you do some of this mathematical stuff. And the way they described it is, while at the end, when they're writing it up for a journal, they put it in a conventional form, they were in some kind of altered state of consciousness where mathematics was perceived differently, and they could do some things with it that made a difference to them and led them on to certain discoveries. Oh no, yeah, so let's use this. Don't quote, we only use 10% of our brain now. I just read an article yesterday debunking where the heck did that 10% idea come from. It's totally wrong. The whole thing's
firing off.
But if you change that into, we clearly don't use a lot of our potentials very well. Yes.
2 more questions. Do you have optimism or pessimism when you think about the autocrats around the world? Climate change, maybe 12 years we have to stop from going past 1.5 centigrades. Optimist or pessimist?
I can answer that at 2 levels. First is when you ask me about my Enneagram type, I'm a 7. 7s are optimistic. It's just built into me. I'm biased to see good potentials in things, whether they're actually there or not. On the one hand, it makes me more sensitive to spotting good potentials. It also makes me liable to imagine good potentials that aren't there. But on another level, I have been very impressed by the work of this Harvard psychologist, Steven Pinker, in looking at actual data on the conditions of people. So, for instance, we talk about the 20th century as the bloodiest century in history with its wars and all that, and things are getting worse and worse. Well, he went back and found the statistics. The 20th century was the most peaceful century we have records for.
Wow.
Yes, more people were killed, but there were a heck of a lot more people in the world. The percentage of people murdered or killed in war was way down. Look at people living below the poverty line. It used to be 30% in a lot of countries. It's down to 18%. Oh, wait a minute. Look at life. There's a lot of actual statistical data that says, yeah, terrible things happen, and those are the ones that get in the news. But on a lot of levels, we're doing better. I prefer to go with that. I can look at all the negative stuff and get very depressed about the whole thing, right? And what was that Kingston Trio song, that you hate everybody, but we've got the A-bomb and we can end it all or something. But what good would depressing myself do? I prefer to think there are good possibilities and hope that the things I help to find out about the nature of the mind can help people have transpersonal experiences that'll make us care more about each other or something. Maybe that'll help a little bit. It works better for me.
Got it. Last question is, have we left anything out that you would like to be included?
Several thousand things, I'm sure. But I think we've covered an awful lot of stuff. So let's just leave it here. It's been a delight.
Oh, thank you. So I will